The iron gates of Holloway Ranch clanged shut behind Jasmine Norton as the overseer shoved her forward into the dusty courtyard. And she stumbled but refused to fall, her pride the only possession she had left in this God-forsaken corner of Colorado territory in 1878. The other women who worked the kitchens and laundry whispered warnings as she passed, their eyes darting toward the main house where Dalton Lockhart ruled with an iron fist and a heart rumored to be even harder. She had heard the stories during her 3-day journey from Denver, how the young ranch owner had built his empire through ruthless deals and cold calculation, how he had turned away starving families during the harsh winter of '76 without a second glance, how his own foreman had quit after watching Dalton shoot a horse with a broken leg without even checking if it could be saved. But Jasmine needed this job desperately, her father's gambling debts having cost them everything including their small homestead. And when he drank himself to death 6 months later, she found herself alone in a world that had little mercy for women with no family and no money. The ranch sprawled across the valley east of Salida, thousands of acres of grazing land that produced the finest cattle in Chaffee County. Dalton Lockhart had inherited it at 19 when his father died of influenza, and in the 5 years since, he had doubled its size through shrewd purchases and intimidation tactics that kept neighboring ranchers nervous. At 24, he was one of the wealthiest men in the territory and one of the most feared. Jasmine watched from the kitchen window that first evening as he rode in with his men, sitting tall in the saddle on a black stallion that seemed as fierce as its owner. He dismounted with fluid grace despite the long day, his dark hair shadowed by his worn Stetson, his jaw set in a permanent scowl that warned everyone to keep their distance. She kept her head down those first weeks, scrubbing pots until her hands cracked and bleeding, hauling water from the well before dawn, serving meals to the ranch hands who eyed her with mixture of pity and interest. Dalton never looked at her directly during those early days, treating all the household staff like furniture, barking orders without meeting anyone's eyes. But Jasmine noticed things about him that others missed because they were too afraid to look closely. She saw how he checked every horse in the stable each night, running his hands over their legs with surprising gentleness, even though his face remained expressionless. She noticed how he always made sure the ranch hands were fed before taking his own meal, though he would fire a man for the smallest infraction without hesitation. There was something locked deep inside him, something that had been buried so long ago that maybe even he had forgotten it was there. The confrontation came on a Tuesday in late September, when the aspen trees were turning gold on the mountainsides. One of the ranch hands, a cruel man named Tucker who enjoyed tormenting anyone weaker than himself, had cornered Jasmine in the feed room, his whiskey breath hot against her face as he pressed her against the rough wooden wall. She fought back with all her strength, her knee connecting with his groin just as the door swung open. Dalton stood in the doorway, his gray eyes taking in the scene with that calculating coldness that never seemed to warm. Tucker stumbled back, already making excuses, but Dalton held up one hand for silence. "Get back to work," he said flatly, and Jasmine felt her heart sink with the realization that he did not care what had almost happened. But then he turned to Tucker, and something in his voice dropped to a register that made even the autumn air seem to freeze. "You are finished here. Take your pay and be off this ranch within the hour. If I see you near any of my property or staff again, I will not be calling the sheriff." Tucker sputtered protests, but Dalton had already dismissed him, turning his attention to Jasmine with that same unreadable expression. "Are you hurt?" The question was clinical, like he was assessing damage to equipment. "No, sir," she managed, forcing herself to meet his eyes. They were lighter than she had thought, gray like storm clouds, and for just a moment something flickered in their depths before the shutters came down again. "Get back to your duties." He walked away without another word, his boots echoing on the packed earth. That night, lying on her narrow cot in the women's quarters, Jasmine could not stop thinking about that brief moment when his mask had slipped. She had seen something there, just a flash, that looked almost like concern. It made no sense given everything she knew about Dalton Lockhart, but she trusted her instincts, and they told her there was more to this heartless cowboy than anyone suspected. The next weeks brought an unexpected shift in their interactions. Dalton began appearing in the kitchen during odd hours, ostensibly checking supplies or discussing menus with the head cook. But Jasmine caught him watching her when he thought she was not looking. She was wiping down the long wooden table one evening when he walked in alone, the house quiet except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. He poured himself coffee from the pot on the stove, his movements deliberate and controlled. "You raid," he said abruptly, not quite a question. She had been caught the previous Sunday with a battered copy of poetry she had salvaged from her old life, sitting under a cottonwood tree during her few hours of rest. "Yes, sir. My mother taught me before she passed." He nodded slowly, his fingers wrapped around the tin cup. "My mother taught me too. My father thought it was foolish, waste of time that could be spent learning the ranch." There was no emotion in his voice, just facts being stated. "She died when I was 8. Fever took her in 3 days." Jasmine felt her chest tighten with unexpected sympathy. "I am sorry, that must have been terrible." His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "It was a long time ago, nothing to be done about it now." He set down the cup and left without another word, but something had shifted between them. Some invisible wall had developed the smallest crack. She started leaving books in places where he might find them. Volumes of Walt Whitman and Henry Wadsworth Longfellow that she borrowed from the small lending library in Salida during her monthly trip to town for supplies. They were never discussed, but she noticed they would disappear for a few days before reappearing exactly where she had left them. And once she found a wildflower pressed between the pages like a silent thank you. October arrived with cold winds blowing down from the Sawatch Range, and the ranch prepared for the autumn cattle drive to market. Dalton would be gone for 3 weeks, leading his men south to Colorado Springs, where the railroad offered the best prices. The morning he left, Jasmine was in the courtyard hanging laundry when he rode past. He reined in his horse, looking down at her with that inscrutable expression, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. "The new foreman, Miller, is in charge while I am gone," he said finally. "If you need anything, or if anyone causes trouble, you tell him directly. I have made it clear that all staff are to be treated with respect." His eyes held hers, and she understood the unspoken message. He was protecting her in his own cold way. "Thank you, Mr. Lockhart. Safe travels." Something flickered across his face again, that same brief softening she had glimpsed before. "Dalton," he said quietly. "You can call me Dalton." Then he was gone, riding out at the head of his crew, and Jasmine stood with wet linens in her hands, wondering what was happening between them and whether she was foolish to hope it might be something real. The 3 weeks passed slowly. She threw herself into her work, taking on extra tasks to keep busy. The head cook, a kind woman named Mrs. Patterson who had been with the Lockhart family since Dalton was a boy, noticed her distraction. They were kneading bread dough one morning when the older woman spoke carefully. "He is not what people think, you know, that boy. His father was a hard man, believed affection made people weak, beat it out of Dalton before he was 10 years old. When his mother died, it was like watching a light go out. He learned to survive by shutting everything down, feeling nothing, showing nothing. Mrs. Patterson's weathered hands worked the dough with practiced rhythm, but I have seen glimpses over the years, little kindnesses he thinks no one notices. The widow Thompson and her children would have starved that winter of '76, but somehow money kept appearing in her mailbox. Anonymous, they said, but I knew his handwriting on the wrapping. And old Sam, who used to work the stables, when his mind started going and he could not work anymore, Dalton set him up in a cottage in town and pays his expenses still. Tells everyone the man earned it through years of service, but no other ranch owner would do the same. Jasmine listened, her heart beating faster. "Why are you telling me this?" Mrs. Patterson smiled, her eyes crinkling. "Because I have seen how he looks at you when he thinks no one is watching, and I see how you look at him. He needs someone brave enough to reach past those walls he has built. Someone who will not give up on him." When Dalton returned on a cold November afternoon, Jasmine was in the stable checking on one of the pregnant mares. She heard the commotion of the returning riders and stepped out into the fading light, brushing hay from her skirt. He saw her immediately, his gaze locking onto hers across the courtyard, and she watched as his rigid posture relaxed almost imperceptibly. He dismounted and handed his reins to one of the hands, then walked toward her with purpose. "The mare?" he asked, nodding toward the stable. "She is doing well. I have been keeping an eye on her like you asked before you left. You did not have to do that. It is not part of your duties." Jasmine lifted her chin. "I wanted to. I like the horses, and she seemed lonely." Something in his expression shifted, the hard lines around his mouth softening just slightly. "Walk with me," he said quietly, and it was not quite an order but not quite a request either. They walked in silence toward the eastern pasture, where the last rays of sunlight painted the mountains in shades of copper and gold. The evening was crisp, their breath forming small clouds in the cooling air. Dalton stopped at the fence line, resting his forearms on the top rail, his eyes on the distant peaks. "My father used to say that caring about things makes you vulnerable," he said finally, his voice low. "That the only way to survive is to be harder than everyone else, to never let them see weakness. After my mother died, he made sure I learned that lesson well. No tears, no softness, no mercy, just work and control and power." Jasmine moved closer, standing beside him at the fence. "That sounds like a lonely way to live." "It is." The admission seemed to surprise him as much as it surprised her. He turned to look at her, and for the first time she saw real emotion in those gray eyes, a vulnerability that took her breath away. "But lately I have been thinking that maybe he was wrong. Maybe shutting everything out is not strength. Maybe it is just cowardice." Her hand found his on the fence rail, her smaller fingers curling over his calloused ones. He did not pull away, and she felt him trembling slightly beneath her touch, this man who the whole county feared, shaking like a wild horse learning to trust for the first time. "You are not a coward, Dalton," she said firmly. "You are one of the strongest people I have ever met. But there is a difference between strength and hardness. Strength allows room for kindness. Hardness just breaks eventually." He turned his hand over beneath hers, his fingers intertwining with hers, and the gesture felt more intimate than a kiss. They stood there as the sun disappeared behind the mountains, and the stars began to emerge, neither of them speaking, both of them understanding that something fundamental had changed between them. The winter that followed was harsh, with storms rolling down from the high country every few days, burying the ranch in snow that had to be cleared from pathways and roofs. But inside the main house, something was thawing. Dalton began taking his evening meal in the kitchen, instead of the formal dining room, sitting at the long table with Mrs. Patterson and Jasmine, and whatever ranch hands were not on duty. He was still quiet, still guarded, but occasionally he would offer a wry observation that made everyone laugh, and his eyes would find Jasmine's across the table with a warmth that made her heart race. Christmas came with a fierce blizzard that trapped everyone indoors for 3 days. The ranch hands bunked in the barn and bunkhouse, keeping fires burning and tending to the animals. On Christmas Eve, when the snow finally stopped and the world lay silent under a blanket of white, Dalton appeared in the kitchen where Jasmine was cleaning up after dinner. "Come with me," he said, and there was something almost boyish in his expression, an excitement he could not quite hide. He led her to the front parlor where a fire crackled in the hearth. In the corner stood a small pine tree, decorated with paper ornaments and strings of popcorn. On the mantel, someone had arranged candles and sprigs of evergreen. It was simple but beautiful, and Jasmine felt tears prick her eyes. "Mrs. Patterson said your family used to make a celebration of Christmas," Dalton said, watching her reaction carefully. "I thought perhaps we could start that tradition here. Did you do this?" She turned to him, seeing the uncertainty in his face, this powerful man suddenly vulnerable and hoping he had done the right thing. "Mrs. Patterson helped with the decorations, but the idea was mine. I wanted," he stopped, struggling with words. "I wanted you to have something that felt like home." Jasmine crossed the space between them and reached up to cup his face in her hands, feeling the roughness of his evening stubble against her palms. "This is home," she whispered. "Wherever you are, that is home for me now." He kissed her then, hesitant at first as if he had forgotten how to be gentle, but she showed him with her response that gentleness was not weakness but a different kind of strength. His arms came around her, pulling her close, and she felt the rapid beating of his heart against her chest. When they finally pulled apart, his eyes were suspiciously bright. "I do not know how to do this," he admitted roughly. "I do not know how to be what you need. Just be yourself. Be the man I've come to know, the one who checks the horses every night and makes sure the widow Thompson has enough to eat and hires women with no other options because he cannot stand to see them desperate. That man is exactly who I need." "That man is learning who he is because of you," Dalton said, his thumb tracing her cheekbone. "You have broken through every defense I built, Jasmine. You have made me feel things I thought were dead inside me. I love you, and that terrifies me more than anything I have ever faced." "I love you too," she whispered and kissed him again, softer this time, a promise of all the days to come. The winter slowly gave way to spring, and with the changing season came changes in Dalton that amazed everyone who knew him. He smiled more often, genuine expressions of warmth that transformed his face from stern to handsome. He started holding regular meetings with his ranch hands to hear their concerns and suggestions, treating them like valued employees rather than expendable labor. He donated money to build a school in Salida, and when the preacher praised his generosity, he simply said that education should be available to everyone, thinking of his mother and the books she had loved. But the biggest change was in how he treated Jasmine. He courted her properly, taking her on buggy rides into town on Sunday afternoons, bringing her wildflowers he picked himself from the high meadows, sitting with her in the evenings reading poetry aloud while she mended or knitted. The ranch hands teased him good-naturedly about being smitten, and instead of glowering at them, he would smile and admit they were right. In May, with the valley green and lush and the Arkansas River running high with snowmelt, Dalton took Jasmine riding up into the foothills. They followed a trail that switchbacked through aspen groves and pine forests, until they emerged onto a high meadow carpeted with wildflowers, columbines and Indian paintbrush, and lupine creating a tapestry of purple and red and blue. The view stretched for miles, the Sawatch Range rising majestically to the west, Salida and the ranch visible far below in the valley. "My mother used to bring me here," Dalton said, helping Jasmine down from her horse. "Before she got sick." She said this was where earth touched heaven, and if you listened carefully, you could hear God speaking in the wind. They walked through the flowers, their hands linked, breathing in the thin mountain air. Dalton was quiet for a long time, his expression thoughtful, and Jasmine let him work through whatever he needed to say. Finally, he stopped and turned to face her, his gray eyes clear and full of an emotion that made her breath catch. "I spent so many years convinced that I had to be hard to survive, that love was a luxury I could not afford," he began. "But you showed me that I was wrong about everything. Love is not a luxury, Jasmine. It is what makes survival worthwhile. You have given me back pieces of myself I thought were lost forever. You have made me believe that I can be better than what my father tried to make me." He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a small velvet box, dropping to one knee in the flowers. Jasmine's heart hammered in her chest as he opened it to reveal a delicate gold ring set with a small diamond that caught the sunlight. "Jasmine Norton, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Would you let me spend the rest of my life showing you the gentleness and love you have taught me to feel again?" Tears streamed down her face as she nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. "Yes," she finally managed. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger and stood, sweeping her into his arms and spinning her around while she laughed and cried at the same time. When he set her down, he kissed her with a passion that still held tenderness, and she knew without doubt that this heartless cowboy had found his heart again, because she had been brave enough to look past the walls to see the man inside. They were married in June in a simple ceremony at the small church in Salida, with half the town attending out of sheer curiosity to see the fearsome Dalton Lockhart transformed into a groom who could not stop smiling. "Mrs. Patterson cried through the entire service, dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief and declaring it the happiest day she had seen in 30 years. The reception was held at the ranch, with tables set up in the courtyard and music provided by a fiddle player from town. Dalton danced with his bride under the stars, holding her close and whispering promises in her ear about the life they would build together. Their first year of marriage brought adjustments and joys in equal measure. Jasmine took on more responsibilities managing the household, and she implemented changes that made life better for everyone on the ranch. She started a lending library for the staff, stocking it with books purchased on trips to Colorado Springs. She convinced Dalton to build better quarters for the ranch hands, with proper insulation and heating for the brutal winters. She organized social events that brought the community together, barn dances and harvest celebrations that replaced fear with friendship. Dalton watched his wife work her magic on his ranch and his reputation, and he fell more in love with her every day. She challenged him when she disagreed with his decisions, pushed him to consider perspectives he might have dismissed before, celebrated his victories, and comforted him through setbacks. He found himself looking forward to each evening when they would retreat to their private quarters, talking for hours about everything and nothing, making love with a passion that never diminished, sleeping tangled together as if afraid to be apart even in dreams. In the spring of their second year together, Jasmine discovered she was pregnant. She broke the news to Dalton one evening after dinner, taking his hand and placing it on her still flat stomach. He stared at her in shock, his face cycling through disbelief, wonder, and finally pure joy. "A baby." His voice cracked. "We are going to have a baby. We are going to have a baby," she confirmed, laughing at his dazed expression. He pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe, and she felt wetness on her neck and realized this strong man was crying. When he finally pulled back, tears streaming unashamedly down his face, he looked younger than she had ever seen him. "I am going to be a father," he whispered in awe. "Jasmine, I am going to be a father. What if I am like him? What if I do not know how?" She cupped his face, making him meet her eyes. "You will be nothing like your father because you have already learned what he never could. You know how to love, Dalton. You know how to be gentle. You will be exactly the father our child needs." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the summer and into the autumn. Dalton became almost comically protective, insisting that Jasmine rest more, hiring additional staff so she would not overwork herself, consulting with the doctor in Salida so frequently that the man finally told him to stop worrying. But Jasmine found his concern endearing rather than stifling, another sign of how far he had come from the cold man she had first met. Their son was born on a crisp October morning in 1881, arriving with a lusty cry that announced his presence to the entire household. Dalton held his son for the first time with shaking hands, counting tiny fingers and toes, marveling at the perfect little features. When the baby wrapped one small hand around his father's finger, Dalton looked at Jasmine with such overwhelming love and gratitude that fresh tears spilled down both their faces. "What should we name him?" she asked softly, exhausted but happy. Dalton thought for a moment, his son still gripping his finger. "Thomas, after my mother's father. He was a good man, gentle and kind. She used to tell me stories about him." "Thomas Lockhart," Jasmine tested the name. "It is perfect." Fatherhood completed Dalton's transformation in ways that surprised even those who had witnessed his gradual change. He was devoted to his son, spending hours just watching him sleep, taking him on gentle horseback rides as he grew older, reading to him every night from the same books Jasmine had once left out for Dalton to find. The ranch hands joked that the boss had gone completely soft, but there was genuine affection in their teasing, and Dalton took it all with good humor. The ranch continued to prosper under Dalton's management, but now his success was tempered with compassion. He became known throughout the region as a tough but fair employer, someone who drove hard bargains but always kept his word, who expected much from his people but rewarded them generously. Neighboring ranchers who had once feared him now sought his advice and partnership. The town of Salida benefited from his philanthropy, with a new school and library funded in large part by Lockhart money. Thomas grew into a bright, curious child with his father's gray eyes and his mother's warm smile. He followed Dalton everywhere when he was old enough, learning the ranch operations and soaking up his father's knowledge. But unlike Dalton's own childhood, Thomas's education included tenderness and affection. Dalton hugged his son freely, told him he loved him every day, encouraged his interests even when they did not directly relate to ranching. He was determined to give Thomas the childhood he himself had been denied. When Thomas was 3, Jasmine gave birth to twin daughters, Emma and Sarah, who arrived during a spring snowstorm that delayed the doctor and forced Mrs. Patterson to serve as midwife. The girls were tiny and perfect, and Dalton was completely overwhelmed by the sight of his wife nursing both babies at once, this woman who had given him a family he never thought he would have. "How did I get so lucky?" he asked one night, sitting on the edge of their bed, a sleeping daughter in each arm while Jasmine rested against the pillows. "It was not luck," she said gently. "It was choice. You chose to let me in. You chose to change. You chose to become the man you were always meant to be." "No," he corrected softly, looking down at his daughters with wonder. "You broke through when I could not choose. You saved me, Jasmine. You and these beautiful children. You gave me a reason to find the part of myself I thought was dead." The years flowed by in a pattern of seasons and celebrations, challenges and triumphs. Thomas learned to read sitting on his father's lap in the ranch office, sounding out words from ledgers and contracts. The twins grew into mischievous little girls who had their father wrapped around their tiny fingers, and Dalton discovered that saying no to his daughters was nearly impossible. Jasmine managed it all with grace and humor, keeping the household running smoothly, raising their children with firm love, and remaining Dalton's partner in every sense of the word. In 1888, when Thomas was 7 and the twins were 4, the family took a trip to Denver for the Colorado State Fair. It was Thomas's first time in a real city, and his excitement was contagious. They stayed in a hotel, visited museums, and attended performances at the Opera House. But the highlight for Dalton came unexpectedly one afternoon when they passed a small photography studio. "Can we have our portrait taken?" Jasmine asked, and Dalton found himself agreeing despite his lifelong aversion to such things. They posed for the photographer, Dalton and Jasmine seated with Thomas standing between them, and the twins perched on their laps. The photographer instructed them to remain still, to look serious as was the custom, but just before he triggered the shutter, Emma said something that made everyone laugh. The photograph captured that moment of genuine joy, a family united in love and laughter. When they returned home with the framed portrait, Dalton hung it in the parlor where his father's stern image had once dominated. He stood back and studied it for a long moment, this evidence of how far he had come, how different his life was from the one that had seemed inevitable. "Do you think he would be disappointed?" he asked Jasmine quietly. "My father, I mean. Do you think he would see this as weakness?" Jasmine slipped her hand into his. "I think he was a broken man who broke his son because he did not know any better. But you healed Dalton. You became whole. And our children will never know that kind of pain because you chose a different path." He pulled her close, kissing the top of her head. "I chose you. That made all the difference." As Thomas grew older, he began taking on more responsibilities around the ranch, learning the business from his father with an enthusiasm that filled Dalton with pride. But there was a gentleness in the boy that Dalton nurtured rather than suppressing, teaching him that kindness and strength could coexist. The twins developed distinct personalities, Emma bold and adventurous while Sarah was thoughtful and studious, but both of them adored their parents and their big brother. The ranch continued to expand and prosper, but Dalton never forgot the lessons Jasmine had taught him. He maintained his reputation for fairness, treating his employees well and contributing generously to community causes. He and Jasmine became pillars of Salida society, hosting gatherings that brought people together and supporting any initiative that improved life in the valley. In the autumn of 1892, on their 11th wedding anniversary, Dalton took Jasmine back to the high meadow where he had proposed. The children stayed with Mrs. Patterson, who was getting older but still sharp as ever, and delighted to spoil her honorary grandchildren. The ride up the mountain was familiar now, a journey they had made many times over the years, but it never lost its magic. They stood in the meadow, now golden with autumn grasses, and looked out over the valley that held everything they loved. Dalton pulled Jasmine against his chest, his arms wrapped around her from behind, his chin resting on her head. "You remember when you first came to the ranch?" he asked. "I was so determined to feel nothing, to keep everyone at a distance. I thought it made me strong." "I remember," she said, her hands covering his where they rested on her stomach. "You were the most stubborn man I had ever met, but I could see past the walls even then. I could see the man you were trying so hard to hide. You were braver than I was." You risked everything on the hope that I might be worth saving." Jasmine turned in his arms to face him. "You were always worth it, Dalton. You just needed someone to show you." He kissed her then, deeply and thoroughly, this woman who had changed his entire life with her courage and love. When they finally pulled apart, he smiled that warm, genuine smile that still took her breath away after all these years. "I was thinking," he said, "that we should add on to the house. Build a bigger library, maybe a music room. The children are growing and we should make space for whatever interests they develop. And perhaps," he paused, looking almost shy, "perhaps we might have more children, if you would want that." Jasmine laughed, delighted by this man who had once been so cold and was now so full of love that he wanted to fill their home with even more. "I think that sounds wonderful. All of it." They stood together as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink and orange. Below them, the ranch spread across the valley, home to their family and their dreams and their future. It had been 14 years since Jasmine had arrived at those iron gates, desperate and alone, facing an uncertain future with the heartless cowboy who ruled Holloway Ranch. But she had seen something in him that day, some spark of humanity buried deep beneath layers of pain and protection, and she had been brave enough to reach for it. Dalton had spent his entire childhood learning to be hard, believing that was the only way to survive in a cruel world. His father had beaten the softness out of him, and his mother's death had seemed to confirm that caring about anything only led to pain. He had built walls so high and thick that no one could reach him, and he had convinced himself that was exactly what he wanted. But Jasmine had broken through those walls with her quiet strength and unwavering belief that he was more than the heartless reputation he had cultivated. She had shown him that gentleness was not weakness but courage, that allowing himself to feel and love and care made him stronger, not weaker. Together, they had built something beautiful from the broken pieces of his past. They had created a family filled with love and laughter, a ranch that was known for compassion as much as prosperity, a legacy that would honor his mother's memory rather than perpetuate his father's cruelty. Dalton Lockhart, who had once been the most feared and heartless cowboy in Chaffee County, had become a man defined by his capacity for gentleness and love. And it had all begun with a desperate young woman who refused to give up on him, who saw past the hardness to the tender heart he had learned to hide. As the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, they mounted their horses and rode back down to the ranch, to their children waiting with Mrs. Patterson, to the home they had built together on a foundation of love that had transformed them both. The heartless cowboy had learned to show kindness, and in doing so, he had discovered that gentleness was the greatest strength of all. Their story was not about a woman changing a man, but about two people helping each other become the best versions of themselves, about finding love in unexpected places, and having the courage to let it transform everything. The lights of Holloway Ranch glowed warm and welcoming as they approached, and Dalton felt his heart swell with gratitude for the life he now lived, so different from the lonely existence he had once thought was his fate. Jasmine had given him the greatest gifts imaginable, not just their children and the happy home, but the ability to feel deeply and love fully and live openly. She had broken through his defenses and taught him that being vulnerable did not mean being weak, that showing kindness did not make him a target, that allowing himself to care made life worth living. They would face challenges ahead, as all families do, but they would face them together with the strength that came from genuine partnership and abiding love. Their children would grow up knowing they were cherished, free to be whoever they wanted to become, never forced to hide their true selves behind walls of protection. The ranch would continue to prosper under their stewardship, known throughout Colorado as a place of both excellence and compassion. And every night, Dalton and Jasmine would lie in each other's arms, grateful for the day that fate had brought them together, for the courage they had both shown in breaking down barriers and building bridges, for the love that had healed old wounds and created new possibilities. In the end, theirs was a story of transformation and redemption, proof that even the hardest heart can soften when touched by genuine love, that gentleness can bloom even in the harshest conditions when nurtured with patience and faith. Dalton Lockhart had learned to be gentle for the first time because Jasmine Norton had been brave enough to break through every defense, wise enough to see his potential, and loving enough to help him find his way back to his own humanity. Together, they had created something lasting and beautiful, a love that would endure through all the seasons of their lives, a family that would carry forward the lessons they had learned, a legacy built not on fear and hardness but on kindness and compassion and the transformative power of love.